Good afternoon, and welcome to each of you to our Wednesday Word. My name is Amy Gingrich, and I'm publisher and executive director at Menno Media, where we publish an adult Bible study curriculum. Our adult Bible study provides a quarterly look at the Bible from an Anabaptist perspective, and our study is used each year by many individuals across the United States and Canada. Since churches started meeting digitally in March with the onset of COVID-19, we've been thinking about how to deliver additional helps to congregations at this time. This new webinar, as well as our adaptive church webinar series that we're offering to pastors and congregational leaders, grows out of that thinking. And today I am delighted to welcome all who have registered to attend. The Bible study this quarter from Menno Media focuses on the many faces of wisdom. God is experienced as wisdom in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. During this study, we explore the many facets of wisdom as recorded in the book of Proverbs, the Gospels, and the letter of James. In the month of June, we are specifically looking together at the nature of God's wisdom as understood in the book of Proverbs. Today's webinar is on the third session from the summer quarter of Adult Bible Study, The Gifts of Wisdom. Our webinar is being recorded and it will be available later online after we do some editing to the file. During today's webinar, I invite you to send in comments and questions through the Q&A function as you have them, and we will make time for those at the end. I am delighted today to welcome our Bible study conversationalists. Today we have Gordon Matties, the writer of the Summer Adult Bible Study material, Susan Janzen, and Byron Pellecer. Before we turn it over to Gordon to begin the discussion, I invite each of the conversationalists to introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Amy. I'm Gordon Matties, as she said. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba. We're experiencing a delightfully hot day today, around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 Celsius. I've been teaching at Canadian Mennonite University for quite a few years, since 1984, and recently retired. And it was a pleasure writing this Bible study guide.
And I'm Susan Janzen. I live just outside of Iowa City, Iowa, and I'm coming to you from my office in Kelowna, Iowa. I am conference minister for ministerial leadership for Central Plains Mennonite Conference. I've been at this for about a year now, or just under a year. Before that, I spent 20 years as a congregational minister in Nebraska and Iowa, and before that worked in church publishing out of the former General Conference offices in Newton, Kansas. And so in my lifetime, I've written a couple of units of Adult Bible Study Guide, and I still work with the Church of the Brethren in editing their counterpart to Adult Bible Study Guide. So I'm glad to be with you again.
Hello, my name is Byron Pellecer. I am currently located in Harrisonburg in Virginia, enjoying family, weather, and anything else that is around. Currently, I am on transitions in ministry, and I have written numerous articles in different topics for different magazines, both English and Spanish, and I have done also some writing for modules, a couple of those, and currently I am working on one that is on preaching for the Anabaptist Biblical Institute. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to this conversation as usual.
Gordon, we turn it over to you to begin the conversation.
All right, thank you very much. It's good to be here. As you were all talking, I thought of some other things I could have shared in my introduction to Proverbs 8, but we can come back to those later. I'm hoping that you folks have Bibles accessible and that you think about questions and comments. Along the way, I'm going to be posing some questions. I have 6 questions that I will ask related to the text of Proverbs 8, and you're welcome to jot them down or note a question or two that are of interest to you. So in the past 2 weeks, we explored Proverbs 1 and 2. Today, we leapfrog over chapters 3 through 7 and take a look at Proverbs 8. But before we go there, Notice a few of the exhortations to pursue wisdom and the promises of wisdom's benefits in chapters 3 and following. For example, chapter 3, verses 15 to 18, we have these fine lines. About wisdom, long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Happy are those who find wisdom. She is a tree of life to those who hold her fast. Or take another example from chapter 4, verse 7. We find this remarkable and enigmatic line. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Do you get it? And then the line goes on to say, prize her highly and she will exalt you. But it's as though the writer is saying, look, there's nothing more I can say except the most important thing in life is to get wisdom. Mm. So anyway, we'll get back to that. These chapters, 1 through 7, warn about counterfeit pleasures, short-sighted benefits, and illegally gotten gains, and the dangers of having bad friends. By contrast, wisdom promises quite a lot, as we have heard, and therefore pursuing wisdom is the greatest vocation of all. Now, in these chapters, the voice of the parent and the voice of wisdom sometimes merge into one. In chapter 8, wisdom is personified as a woman. Now, even in chapter 7, verse 4, we read, say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend. So now, let's look at Proverbs 8. And I'm going to be running through the chapter section by section, as in the study guide. So in verses 1 to 4, we find wisdom herself calling out, as she did in chapter 1. Again, she stands at the crossroads in public, at the gates of the town, at the main intersections, at the mall, let's say. Her call is universal, she says in verse 4, to all that live. So here's my first question, the first of 6. What are the main intersections today where we might hear wisdom's call? If she stands at the crossroads and at the gates of the town, where might we stand? Where might we go? Or where might she be today where we might hear her call? Now, turning to verses 5 through 9. Wisdom offers straightforward instruction about flourishing in life. Now, there's a paradox in her claims. Although all her words are righteous and there's nothing crooked in them, she says. She also says in verse 9 that, quote, to the discerning, all of them, that is my words, all of them are right. They are upright to those who have found knowledge. So my second question, what does it mean that to recognize the truth, one must already know it? If the truthfulness of her words are discernible to those who have already found knowledge, how do we understand the relationship there? To know the truth, one must already know it? Or to recognize it, one must know it? What does that mean? Then verses 10 and 11 offer us a clear choice. She uses the word instead. Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. How can that be? So my third question, what does it mean that she uses the word instead here? Is she saying, don't even think of career or prosperity. Choose wisdom instead. We'll come back to that later. Then, in verses 12 through 21, wisdom offers her credentials. Wisdom makes it quite clear early on that the fear of the Lord is not a spiritual matter divorced from the moral life. Because wisdom hates evil, verse 13, reverence for the Lord involves hatred of evil. Now then, after using the word instead in verse 10, now in verse 19, she uses the word better. Wisdom's fruit is better than gold, even fine gold. So although the instead of verse 10 comes first, what comes last is the promise of wealth in verse 21. But notice that verse 21 comes right after wisdom's confession that her life is characterized by righteousness and justice. Two of our key words from the summaries in chapter 1, verse 3, and chapter 2, verse 9, and we talked about those in the 2 previous weeks. So the promises of well-being that we see here must be balanced by the responsibility of walking the path of righteousness and justice, of hating what is evil, the flip side of righteousness and justice. So my fourth question, why does our well-being so often overshadow or take precedence over our moral responsibilities? Why does our well-being so often take precedence over our moral responsibilities? Now to verses 22 to 31. Here I want to highlight one thing. Wisdom woman here in verses 22 to 31 is not a separate entity from God, even though it may appear that way. What's important to notice is how wisdom woman's speech is echoed in the New Testament. In Colossians 1, verse 15, Paul offers a direct interpretation of Proverbs 8, verses 22 to 31. Paul takes up wisdom's affirmation in verse 22 that she is, quote, the first of God's creative acts. And in verse 27, when he established the heavens, I was there. So when Paul says in Colossians 1:15 that Jesus Christ is the firstborn of all creation, we are reading Paul's reinterpretation of wisdom into what we now call wisdom Christology. That is, Paul, is reading Jesus in the light of the Old Testament understanding of wisdom's role in creation. But the general idea is that the role of wisdom in the creative and structuring of the universe is what Paul understood as the role of Christ, present in and with God in the entire creative process. That's why Paul can say in other places, as in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 24, that Christ is the wisdom of God. So my fifth question, might it be possible that Paul's portrait of Jesus as wisdom provides us with a Jesus-centered approach to creation care? Got that? A Jesus-centered approach to creation care. Finally, Wisdom Woman continues her motivational speech in verses 32 to 36. Those who find her find life. And remember verse 17, those who seek me diligently find me. Now remember the paradox from last week of chapter 2, or you can go back and look it up later, the paradox of the quest and the gift. Wisdom assumes that some will not find her, but finding her means daily watching and waiting at her gates. That's what we see in verses 32 to 36. Daily watching and waiting at her gates. So the question this chapter raises is about vocation. Pursue wealth or wisdom. Pursue career or wisdom. Pursue anything or wisdom. You see, she turns priorities upside down. True vocation is the pursuit of wisdom. Do that and do that alone and see what happens. The problem is, in our culture, we've become so accustomed to pursuing other things first. Reminds me of what Jesus said, doesn't it? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And then what? So, we're at a crossroads today, and wisdom comes to us, and we're waiting. With COVID-19 and with the challenges before us of racism, with cultural and political polarization, here's my last question. What does it look like today to be watching daily at wisdom's gates, waiting beside wisdom's doors? In other words, where today might we meet her? What might she tell us? What might she ask us to do? She says in verse 14, I have good advice and sound wisdom. I have insight and I have strength. So let's go now to our conversation with our panelists and then with our other participants.
Thanks, Gordon. I appreciate it very much. There's a lot of things that we need to unpack, or I need to unpack anyway, wrestling with all the questions that you prompted right there. And one of the things that stays with me is that seeking wisdom is the greatest of all treasure. And then something more concrete, how does wisdom actually look like today in the midst of everything else that we are living in? Whether it is the pandemic situation, jobs crisis, economic crisis, even theological crisis, you name it. And alongside with that, your question number 4, I think it was, you did mention something about seeking our well-being that takes precedence over normal responsibilities. And that to me, it's kind of like, I am wrestling with that right now, trying to unpack that. What does it look like? What does it mean? What do you mean by saying my own well-being? And what does the Bible tell me? What does wisdom actually saying and inviting me right now to seek somebody else's well-being? And how does that look like? And if I do that, also the other word is others, seeking the well-being of others. What do we mean by others? Who's others? And based on that I believe that the kingdom of God is inclusive and not exclusive in every sense of the word. And then again, it all depends whose agenda we're talking about, then we can prioritize. But nonetheless, seeking or abandoning my own well-being, what does that look like? What does that mean? And what does it mean also to look the well-being of others? Others mean people that think like I do, or look like I do, or come from where I come from. What does that look like? I don't know, but I don't have that answer, but staying with me. I'm taking measures because I am afraid of something, or because I am seeking the well-being of others anyway. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let me just point us in one direction, one example. I don't have a list of all the Proverbs, but if we were to go to Proverbs 10 through the end of the book and dip in and look at Proverbs that have to do with speech. Okay, so if wisdom is the discernment of appropriate speech and action for any potential situation, the book of Proverbs can't address every situation. That's why we have the quest for wisdom is about discernment in our own time. The book of Proverbs is obviously set in its own context, but if you were to read through chapters 10 and following, looking for every occurrence of references to speech, and some time ago I went through my book of Proverbs, and I wrote the letter S beside every proverb that deals with speech. So I'm just randomly opening my Bible to Proverbs 16 to 18. And I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 references to speech in these 2 pages. So obviously, speech is an important matter. For example, I'm just again randomly looking at chapter 18, verse 6. A fool's lips bring strife, and a fool's mouth invites a flogging. Sorry, that's a terrible example in a way. In the ancient context, you know, this is an extreme statement. The next proverb, the mouths of the fools are their fruit, and their lips a snare to themselves. So one has to ask today, given the many other examples of parables about speech, what kinds of things are appropriate to say in certain contexts or another? And nowadays, for example, just these past 2 to 3 weeks, we've had to ask, depending on who I am, do I have a right or a responsibility to speak or to be silent about certain issues? Am I in a situation, am I qualified or whatever to speak, or is my role now in this situation not to speak, to listen? So the role of the other has to be highlighted, because speaking and listening is a communicative process. So if I want to take seriously the Proverbs advice to speak only appropriately, and by the way, most of us know how easy it is to speak inappropriately, especially in our families and with our friends. And I've had to walk back so many occasions where I have spoken without thinking. And so speech is such an important matter that has to do with communication with others, about others, for others. Which preposition applies in this situation? Do I speak about myself? Do I speak on behalf of others? Or am I silent on behalf of others? So there's a whole bundle of things, just with one example with respect to speech. Maybe you folks want to take it a different direction.
Well, I agree with that. And I think another layer to it is there's a lot of speech that is not necessarily like it's discerning between just noise and wisdom too. I mean, there's a lot that that we hear these days in a lot of different areas of life, that, you know, I'm not saying because it makes me uncomfortable it's not wisdom. I'm not saying that at all. But it's like there's just a lot coming at us from a lot of different directions. And so having this grounding that Proverbs is talking about, and really that's remarkably consistent across the biblical story, is really important, so that as we take in, because I agree that right now for a lot of the people who look like me and are my age and live my life, it is a listening time more than a speaking time. But, you know, it's really important to be able to take what's coming in and process that in different ways so that we can turn it into either changed attitudes or changed policies and changed and the actions that are necessary to be able to help affect change in our world.
Lately, if I may, I've been reading also Jeremiah alongside with this Bible study. And then the conversation, the speaking of God with Jeremiah, it's always intriguing for me. What do you see? Sometimes for other people or even for the divine, it's the obvious. It's what you see in front. But sometimes I can see that. We were making some comments about our glasses. We all wearing glasses, and obviously in different situations, we come with different glasses. Context. So context does matter. And I wonder sometimes if, yeah, speaking, it's my time right now, or listening, or silence, or all of the above, or actions. Anyway, it's different ways. I think not only society, but also the church is very polarized in every sense of the word as well. And we do well to listen and try and error. That's my point. Kind of like I go back and forth. It's kind of like a dance floor. You listen and you speak and you be quiet. Again, you do the process until we come up with something that we believe will be, in all honesty, as much as possible, the well-being of the others as well.
Mhm.
But to me, that's very painful, because that means that I need to learn to give in a lot of things that I am not probably willing to, or I don't want to. And sometimes I can do that on my own free will, or because the circumstances pushes, or because it's the right thing to do, even though it's not the right thing to do. So that's politics anyway. So it's complex, but because it's complex doesn't mean that we cannot actually engage in this type of conversations and actions.
Right. And I think another word that comes to me is humility, that we have to listen with a stance of learning, with a stance of I don't have all the wisdom on this, or I don't have all the understanding on this, or maybe even I need to relearn something because I don't even understand the privilege I have, or how my position on something affects someone else. Yeah.
And actually, I agree with you. Recognize that sometimes we don't have the answers, but being humble enough to say, hey, listen, I don't know if each one of the car dealers uses that, but I remember buying my first used vehicle, beautiful, by the way, and little letter, the fine print says, as is. So I asked, what do you mean as is? And they said, in Miamian, this is supposed in Florida, what you see is what you get. I'm like, oh, that's being genuine. So sometimes what you see is what you get. And sometimes people will not take that as in a good way, but what you see is what you get, bottom line. And I think this is the church. We need to take it. This is the society. We need to take it. All right, so now let's engage and wrestle with it in a humble way.
Yeah.
And humble way means also that we need to be genuine with it.
Exactly.
Right? Because
Exactly.
you can be humble and you're not humble. It's kind of
Right.
pseudo humility, if you will. Then people will notice that anyway.
Right.
I'd like to tack on here to those reflections. The expression "fear of the Lord" in verse 13 carries with it this motif of this underlying understanding of humility. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not depend on your own insight, but in all your ways acknowledge Him. So there's a sense in which fear of the Lord and trusting go hand in hand. But in verse 13, this humility, this trust moves into the hatred of evil. I have a hunch that in our time there's a lot of dispute about what constitutes evil, and a lot of us need to work hard at learning to recognize it, and when it's named as evil, when something or other is named, articulated as evil, we sometimes think, well, that's arrogant. How do you know? But perhaps with the humility of fear of the Lord, of trusting God, that we can discuss what evil is in our time, and maybe it's complicated, maybe it's nuanced, maybe it has a long history of. In fact, in Canada, there are people, what is systemic racism, or what is systemic evil? The director of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was caught the other day saying that there is no systemic racism in the police force. Well, she was challenged by others who said, how can you say that? And so on. I don't have to spin out the whole story. And then she retracted her statement a day or two later, recognizing, aha, this is a complex matter that goes back generations. And we need to be able to talk about what this systemic business is. How is evil rooted in our assumptions and cultural histories in our countries, especially with respect to settlers and Indigenous people in Canada, where that's probably one of the most critical issues of our time, and in the United States, the matter of slavery, and it goes on into matters of race, immigration, and I was listening to a video the other day by a fellow who charted the history of systemic racism in the way American cities were constructed and laws that were established to allow certain people to live in certain parts of town and so on. All of this is now accessible to historians. We know that there was a deep history of selective racism in our countries. And so how do we address that without, how do we address that and look for change?
I think I don't have the answer on that, but just want to make an extra comment on that. It's that I heard you saying that, and we as a society and as a church, we know that. And what really gets me is that we know that for the longest that we can remember. So I wonder what wisdom now it's time probably to get that history. Since we love to collect data, even though I don't like the light word, how lightly we use the word love in the US and Canada anyway, but we love everything except we love people, but not things. And right here, it's part of our vocabulary, but that's another conversation. So we do have that data. We do have that information. We love data, to collect that data. To what extent? To what point? So I wonder if this is probably, if we're sitting at the gates right now and wisdom is coming to us face on, calling and crying out for concrete actions.
Yeah.
Probably. I don't know. Yeah, we are, let me put it this way, as a congregations, we are longing and wanting to be together in the same building. Yeah, we don't need permission to open the church. The church never closed. Buildings closed. Right. The church is still here. Even right now was in this electronic setting. Having said that, maybe wisdom is already right here in my face, and I am in denial.
Yeah.
I don't want to do anything else because that requires extra work in every sense of the word, beginning with me. I'm faced on saying that I'm doing wrong. So history, I don't know whether wisdom is using history as a witness now to say something else.
Okay,
I wonder.
That gets at one of my questions.
It does.
Where is wisdom addressing us now?
Well, and I think it also gets at another one of your questions, which is the, do we choose well-being over moral responsibility? Because I think for those of us who are middle-class Americans, pick your categories if you want to put it that way. I think a lot of what Byron was talking about, we all know, you're right, but it forces change. It forces me to perhaps alter my lifestyle or the things I'm involved in or the way I spend my money or my time if I acknowledge some of those things. And so what are we willing to prioritize to make well-being to make the sense of shalom the really what is important over like how does someone else's well-being take priority over my own well-being sometimes? I mean, I think that's part of what you're getting at here too, or what this is getting at.
Yeah, it's kind of like a social reformations does happen when we listen and work together with those that are socially oppressed, whether it's within or outside of the church, bottom line. The problem, I think, is that in North America, the overall countries, I don't know, Mexico, but at least the two big ones, we tend to kind of like using demons or demonizing this kind of actions, and we call them politically otherwise. That in our lingo, it's not politically correct, but that's another way to oppress and ignore that. Yes, wisdom is knocking on the doors right now and saying, and listen up, we got socially discrepancies right now, whether it's economically, you name it, demographic, the list goes on and on. If we are to conduct a census from a biblical theological foundation, I wonder how many more things we as a church will discover, and whether we're going to be able or willing or open to address those in concrete ways or not. So I think it's both, the reflection, but the action, both. And we need to go to that dance floor, back and forth, and keep trying until we get it all right.
So we should maybe go to any questions, but before we do that, what about, just remember that the book of Proverbs seems to be addressed to young people, you might even say young people in training for public life. Those who attend to you might say, the school of wisdom, under the instruction of wisdom, would find themselves prepared for leadership in the public realm. We don't need to discuss this today, but I think the question of wise leadership is sometimes lacking in our culture, in our political arena. And maybe we don't need to say more about that. But certainly, wisdom is needed in public. That's for sure. Amy, what do you have?
One of the things I wrote down that you were talking was this question of evil versus sin. And the role of wisdom to speak truth to power. We were talking about evil a bit in terms of wisdom, and I was just unpacking in my head the differentiation between those. And as we think about where wisdom is now and how we watch and wait for her, is there a difference? Just a wondering for me here, but in how we differentiate evil and sin as we look for wisdom and speak truth to power. I don't know if we even want to get into that, but that was a wondering of mine as we were talking.
Yeah, well, for sure that one of the big challenges with the whole book of Proverbs is to figure out, what is the bad thing that is being has to be avoided. Bad friends, bad business practices, bad speech, anything that damages the shalom or well-being of self or others or creation,
right,
is evil or is sin. Anything that damages the well-being of others, of creation, or the self. And you can read through the Proverbs, and I think that kind of definition would hold water all the way through. There are things that we do that damage us, that are what Proverbs calls death, the path of death. There are two paths, the path of death and the path of life. That may be too simplistic in our modern world, but the fact is, actions that damage are deathly.
Mm-hmm.
So the path of wisdom is to look for those life-giving pathways for all relationships with us, with others, with creation, with ourselves. So that's a short answer. Do you have any questions or comments from people in the sphere of internet?
We do not at this point have any live questions or comments. One of you two have one final, Byron or Susan, one final question. Otherwise, I might push us a little bit more on life-giving pathways.
Well, I was kind of thinking along in response to what Gordon just said and what you were talking about is I was just thinking about the polarity in our society. And, you know, if we were truly pursuing the path of wisdom, it seems to me that would be an antidote to some of the polarities that we experience. I mean, I think about it in terms of COVID and some of the mitigating actions that we can take, that we're told we ought to be taking, or that are out there for us to be taking, and realizing how politicized certain things like wearing a mask or social distancing have become. And it pains me, because if we were taking, you know, to take seriously the well-being of others, it might mean I do things that may be an inconvenience, or it may be something I don't want to do, but it's the wise thing to do. And so that's just an example of, like, I just wonder how, if we followed the path of wisdom, it would some of the things that cause us such consternation would almost disappear, because the path would be obvious. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, let me respond to that. And something I've been thinking of, talking with friends recently about the cultural milieu that leads to those kinds of tensions and disagreements. Sometimes, especially in the North American culture, and maybe more in the United States than in Canada, it's the rights of the individual that are primary. So that we want to assert our rights as individuals to choose, and not to have anybody tell us what to do. Now, that may be a little bit simplistic, but it seems to me that that's why I put the question the way I did earlier about responsibilities. If we could find a balance between individual rights and social responsibilities, that is what Byron was talking about, the other. If we could find a way of being responsible rather than simply looking for our rights, then we would have more wisdom, I think.
And it becomes
Wisdom
more,
would be practical.
I agree. And also it makes me think about it also, that whether do I have rights when it comes to the well-being of others and vice versa, and what are my rights, if we're going to call it that way, even though whether I don't know if the biblical text calls for rights. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So we tend to mix that language, even the one you use, Amy, sin and evil. I don't hear many preachings and Bible studies, etc., and conversations around theological terms. Instead, we're using other lines of human thoughts. Don't get me wrong, I'm in for it, psychology, you name it. And but what's the conversation? What's the context? What are we reflecting upon? And whether it's another line of thought right here, or is the biblical text? And which one is it that it's informing our lives right now? And you compare that, Gordon and I loved it. How Paul is trying to get Christ in the picture through Sophia. And I don't see them different. And I don't see Sophia as the other and the creation narrative, but rather as a way to inviting us human beings and believers and disciples into a closer relationship with God, intimate.
Yeah.
Because after all, that's what wisdom is all about, being closer to God. Now, how did that look like today? Oh boy. That's another 3 webinars that we can talk about that.
This is really good. All 3 of you have given us a lot to chew on here today and to think more about. I'm really leaving today thinking more about well-being and shalom and responsibility, and how all of these interact with the word wisdom. And I would just think that as we depart today, there's a lot here that we can each continue to unpack in our own lives as we seek out wisdom, as we look for wisdom, as we respond to people around us and use our words. Gordon, as you showed us there in your Bible, the way speech is included so much. Yeah, Gordon.
Yeah, I just want to say one last thing about wisdom in her self-declaration, where she states her credentials. Right at the end of verse 30, after she says, I was beside him, I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. And then she says, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the human race. Wisdom is for us, not against us. Wisdom is there for us. Wisdom is coming to meet us. Yes, we do need to search, and the quest is very real, but wisdom is not somehow wanting to remain obscure.
That's a great reminder for us in this time and at all times. Thank you so much, Gordon and Susan and Byron, for being conversationalists here today. And thank you for all your time and your insights. I know we're all leaving with deeper insights and understandings and ideas to continue to push out in our own lives around wisdom. I also want to thank today those who have joined us in this webinar. Again, our webinar has been recorded, and we will post the link on our Menomedia Facebook page and our Twitter feed in coming days. So please do watch for it there. And join us at the same time next week for Wednesday Word and our continuing study of wisdom. We'll have the same panel with us again next week. And the link will be emailed to everyone who registered today as well, so that you can sign up there. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.